In addition to commenting on the Madison shooting, Democratic candidates running for Wisconsin governor gathered in Superior tonight to answer questions from voters.
The future of Wisconsin public education was the focus of this forum. Northern News Now's Leslie Krebs was at the event and joins us live in studio tonight. Leslie?
Leslie, aside from school funding, the issue of ICE enforcement was brought up.
Yeah, Dana, Laura, Democratic candidates Kelda Roys, Francesca Wong, Mandela Barnes, and Joel Brennan spoke at a forum on the University of Superior, Wisconsin's campus. From public education dollars to ICE enforcement, each candidate shared their positions on the topics. During the forum, one voter asked the candidates how they would handle ICE on school grounds. All the candidates agreed that if they were elected governor, they would protect against the overreach of ICE. They said they would do what they could to protect immigrant students and families, each sharing their stance on the matter, especially when it comes to supporting the federal agency.
We have to make it so that the Attorney General's office can prosecute ICE to the fullest extent of the law.
We have to reject cooperation with ICE unless it's a violent crime we're talking about, or a heinous crime. That is the only level of cooperation that we should experience with any sort of law enforcement in ICE. And yes, they should be absolutely prosecuted when they break the law.
To ensure that it's not only schools, but hospitals, places of worship, courthouses, that ICE knows that they are not welcome in any of those places.
As governor, I will make sure that any ICE agent who breaks our state laws, whether it's busting a car window or whether it's assaulting someone, is held fully accountable under our state laws.
Among other education topics, the candidates also discussed public and private school funding, in particular the state's voucher program. All the candidates say they are against the voucher program and want more transparency when it comes to those taxpayer dollars. They also addressed state legislation to support public schools in Wisconsin. Another Democratic candidate, Milwaukee County Executive David Crowley, was not present. Despite campaigning against one another, each candidate in attendance tonight agreed beating the top Republican candidate, Tom Tiffany, is their main goal. Tiffany was also invited to speak at the forum tonight, but declined. Live in studio, Leslie Krebs, Northern News Now.